Welcome back. Captain Rowland Iyayi, the former MD, Nigerian Airspace Management Agency, known as NAMA. He was also the former technical advisor to the Minister of Aviation, and he is the managing director at Brass Aviation. Good morning, Captain Iyayi, and welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
Now let's get started, and let's get started from the uncomfortable news that we've heard, at least in the last few days. I was studying the situation. I tried not to be too emotional around the news, because this is not the first time that kind of thing has been happening. But I try to look at it very, very critically, and that's why I'm discussing it today. Speak to me about some of those uncomfortable truths that we need to hear around what has transpired between Nigeria and other countries.
Thank you very much. Basically, the convention guiding the relationships when it comes to aviation between countries is usually known as a bilateral air services agreement or multilateral air services agreement, depending on what sort of structure the countries engage in. What Nigeria had done in the past basically was to domicile all our bilateral agreements when we had the national carrier Nigeria Airways under Nigeria Airways, meaning that Nigeria Airways operated all those routes that Nigeria had signed bilateral agreements with different countries. But in the recent past, because Nigeria Airways was liquidated, we only had domestic carriers. Not all the domestic carriers had the capacity, as it were at the time, to operate internationally. We had a few that came on board, but unfortunately, as a result of the fact that most of the host countries were hostile because they practiced what we know as aeropolitics to ease them out of those markets. And invariably, Nigerian government at the time was very docile. Now, what has happened in recent past, essentially, is the Nigerian government waking up to its responsibility to ensure that any domestic airline designated to fly internationally on behalf of Nigeria as a flag carrier is given the same access to markets that the opposite airline enjoys in Nigeria. In the case of, for instance, the UAE, we have Etihad and we also have Emirates flying into Nigeria. In our case, Air Peace has been designated as a domestic carrier to go into the UAE. What had happened was Air Peace didn't have the capacity to operate as many flights as was agreed in the multilateral agreement. So it opted to have 3 frequencies into the UAE. Now, rather than be allowed to fly into Dubai Airport, it was forced to operate into Sharjah for a variety of reasons. Yes, we do have what you call airport slot arrangements, but the issue of reciprocity that is enshrined in the bilateral ordinarily must ensure that, or must establish that, the airline operating out of Nigeria must have been given exactly the same sort of rights in those countries. In the case of Dubai, I think what they did to sort of whittle down the competition of Air Peace was to push them into Sharjah initially. They were operating 3 flights. They had all sorts of issues when they started. Essentially, ploys deliberately designed to frustrate the airline. Nigeria Airways, Nigerian government now waking up to the fact that, look, this cannot continue. Put its feet down to say, listen, yes, you've done this in the past. It's not acceptable. Air Peace wants to come in. It must be given exactly the same sort of rights you've been given in the spots. And the only way to enforce that was to use the big stick, which essentially was what the government did by saying, listen, we're not going to allow you in beyond this date, except, of course, these conditions are met. And I think that's where we are at this point. So essentially, the government should have woken up to this a long time ago.
Do you see this kind of thing repeating itself again? Because this is not the first time, actually.
It's an ongoing thing. Take, for instance, the UK authorities. Heathrow, you'll be told, his slot, is up to its slot capacity. But the multilateral agreement, signed with the UK government should actually ensure that any Nigerian carrier must be given access to Heathrow Airport. But what has happened in the past, for a variety of reasons, you have Nigerian carriers that have gone into Stansted, some into Luton, Gatwick, but none into Heathrow. Arik tried to get into Heathrow, but the slot Arik was given was such a poor slot that it was not even competitive enough to stay viable. And
the same airlines, the British Airways and Co.
They come in here however they want, whenever they want, even when they wanted additional capacities, we granted them. So the issue is the government needs to wake up, like it has done now, to its responsibilities to ensure that the issue of aeropolitics is held high up its priority list at this point, for the sake of ensuring that Nigerian carriers, when they're designated, survive on the routes.
What do you think? Because for me, I've been watching the situation in the past few days, and I summarized it as it all comes down to the economics of it. Because if you take a look at Emirates or these airlines are coming from other places, Nigeria also is a big market. I can say that
it's the largest market.
Yes, it's the largest aviation market in Africa.
Absolutely.
I said, well, we have the biggest or more airlines than other African countries. So if you take a look at it, those airlines from Dubai or UAE or wherever would have also taken a look at the numbers that they're losing and millions of dollars every day. So they will quickly think, oh, guys, this will not favor us at all.
Absolutely.
So at the end of the day, do you think that even as the biggest market in Africa, that we are maximizing our potential?
Absolutely not, no. You see, what you have is what you leverage. Nigeria today has the power of the market, but unfortunately we're not leveraging that power enough in order to be able to get the best deals when it comes to this sort of arrangements. The UAE, a lot of passengers out of Nigeria flying on Emirates are connecting passengers. The UAE has, Emirates is a network airline, meaning that whatever it does, Dubai is just a hub. It feeds different people from different parts of the world into Dubai, and then it funnels them out again as a network carrier. So to that extent, it needs markets like Nigeria. It will not be able to survive the African strategy without Nigeria. So you find that major airlines, British Airways inclusive, have Nigeria as part of its core strategy for Africa. So realizing that, the government should necessarily, leverage that power. We have not done that enough.
Do you think that the government has that in mind, that aviation sector is an economic sector?
Absolutely.
Even though we have more Nigerians flying the roads, I can agree, because I think when I was taking a look at the reports, the air traffic about in the first half of this year, I think over 6 million passengers or so. So, but what I'm trying to say is that aviation is an economic sector. Closely tied to the aviation sector is the travel industry, the hospitality industry, the tourism industry. So how can we look at this sector and come up with reforms or policies, since this is rearing its head again? I know there was a 2005 report, if I'm not mistaken. I think 2005 or 2006. You are in the sector, so you should tell me if I'm right.
2005 Presidential Committee on Aviation. I was a member.
So
Vice Marshal Dike.
Dike,
That's correct.
And he came up with a lot of policies.
Absolutely.
So how do you think that this sector can actually be maximized? We're the biggest market. We have almost everything working for us.
Yes.
Yet it's not
except
working.
The policy.
Yeah.
Now, essentially, when you take that report we wrote in 2006, what we looked at was, globally, we looked at Nigerian economy, not so much of the aviation sector particularly. Aviation, yes, was critical, but we now looked at it vis-a-vis all the other sectors of economy and what was necessary to put the Nigerian market on a global landscape. Now, one of the things we found was that our policies are not consistent with the overall objective of growing the economy. Now, like you said, we have the hospitality, we have all these other sectors tied to aviation. I mean, all these sectors are not, there's no way you can work one without the other. But you see that they all operate as silos. To the extent that you have the tourism industry not talking to aviation, not knowing what is possible, then of course it means that you cannot have a synergy. So there's a need to have a policy framework that would tie the industries that the sectors we're talking together, and have one policy that would ensure that the growth in all these sectors is organized, not chaotic, organized, and having the government drive it, not so much of to invest in it, to drive the policies that would ensure growth.
That will attract private investment,
Absolutely.
you mean? Okay.
Because you see, for instance, let me give you a very simple example. If you go to Kenya, Kenya does not have oil. Kenya thrives on the hospitality industry. And how do they do it? When you fly into Jomo Kenyatta in Nairobi and you want to go into the game reserves, you have smaller airplanes, 10-seaters, taking you right into those ranches for you to spend your 1 week or whatever time you want to spend
see the
there.
lions and
Exactly.
all that.
And then they fly you in there and they come back and take you out again. That is a role of the smaller end of the aviation spectrum in Kenya to ensure that the tourism sector thrives. In Nigeria today, if you want to set up an airline, the policy is that you would go through a process for certification. Now, that process for certification does not distinguish whether you want to operate on the low end of a spectrum or the high end of a spectrum. So we have one common bag, one size fits all.
So you mean the licensing structure?
Is faulty. And it was identified in 2005. It has not been addressed in 2021. The point is, if you license airlines at different categories, air taxi, regional airline, charter airlines, and then of course the major airlines, if you categorize them.
Like we have for the banks.
Yes. You would establish that what is required to run an air taxi operation is not the same as you need for a major airline. So to that extent, the structure and the requirements will not be the same for all the airlines. But today, it is the same for you to get licensed as an airline in Nigeria, whether you're a charter operator, airline operator, or a sort of a major airline operator. The requirements are the same. That should change. We should encourage more smaller airlines, to come into the market, to exploit those supposedly unviable airports. The airports are unviable not because they are so, there's a market. But the size of aircraft being operated by the big airlines the size is not adequate, is not right fit for the smaller markets. You can't fly a huge 737 into an Ibadan airport and expect to come out from there with about 30, 40 passengers. No. But you can operate a 10-seater airport into Ibadan airport and you'll be full.
Now, let me ask this question. Talking about airports viability,
yes,
which you just mentioned, because we're seeing that major airlines flying to the major cities across Nigeria. Yes. With what you're saying right now, will it encourage smaller airlines to come if we have different licensing structure for them, encourage smaller airlines to come into the country and perhaps fly, not so far routes? Let me put it that way. Let's say you want to go from Enugu to Asaba, for example.
Yes.
And you don't want to take the road. Yes. Because of even the security architecture we're seeing right now, which is not favorable.
Well, look, like I said, it boils down to policy. If the CAA woke up today and said, we have 30 airports in the country, of these 30 airports, we have only 3 airports accounting for over 80% of the total traffic. Why is that? That question hasn't been answered in over 2 decades. That question needs to be answered. And to answer that question, you need to look at the policy issues. So if it's a distortion in your market, how do you address it? So that is the issue. So if you now license regional small airlines, you would have an airline based in Enugu, 2-3 airplanes, 10-seaters, operating out of Enugu into Asaba, into Port Harcourt, flying, routine shuttles. And that's their niche. You want to go into Mina from Abuja. It's 3 hours by road. However, it's only 20 minutes by air. But if you had a small airline with 10-seater airplanes, they would fly the route.
Go for a meeting and come back.
Exactly. So the same thing you have in different regions of a country. You can deploy small airlines, and these airlines will be viable in those markets.
So who is responsible for this policy formulation? So is it a failure of regulation?
Well, I mean, regulation is separate and distinct from policy.
Policy.
Policy is an issue to be looked at by the Ministry of Aviation, closely operated by the regulator, the Civil Aviation Authority, the NCAA. So the issue is, if indeed the Aviation Ministry looks at the industry and they ask the question, what are the issues in the industry? Why do we have these problems? What are the possible solutions? That is when we can start having a discussion. But as it is, everybody would say to you, well, the market is liberalized. It means you can do anything you want. That's not entirely correct, because you see, ultimately, the economy suffers. I'll give you an example of Ghana. In Ghana, there's a finite number of, scheduled airlines. The regulator there says they will not allow too many airlines into that market because it will become fragmented to the point where they will become unviable. They know the size of their market. If one of the airlines fail, then they can bring in another airline as a scheduled carrier. In the same vein, in Nigeria, when you want to sort of go to pick up a license, they will ask you to bring a feasibility study. The study should show what you intend to do and how viable it will be. Because beyond the the operational regulatory oversight of the NCAA, there's economic regulatory oversight. So the airlines you're trying to license should show possibility of viability. If they're not going to be viable, there's no point in licensing them. Already, what we have is a situation where when people present their business plans to the CAA, I'm not sure that there's a proper critique to show viability. Because if you're telling me that you're going to come into the market and within 3 months you break even in Nigeria, it's not possible.
So do you think that, Nigerian airlines are not viable? Even though some analysts will say, oh, we even need more airlines.
Again, look at the data you have. Because for me, there's no point talking abstract. Let's dissect the data. What is the average load factor of the current airlines flying? The average load factor. What is their break-even load factor? If your average load factor is below your break-even load factor, you are losing money. It's not rocket science. And I need to know which airline in Nigeria today, the domestic carrier, has the break-even load factor above the average load factor.
That brings me to the question of Nigeria Air. Do we need Nigeria Air? Because if you take a look at the transition from Nigeria Airways, I think liquidated in 2004, to Virgin Nigeria, with Virgin Air, Virgin Atlantic, to, what's the other one, Air Nigeria, now to Nigeria Air. The minister came out a few days ago to say, to set off, I think, 2022, April 2022, gave us the structure, 5% federal government, 49% strategic equity holders, then the remaining, I think, 46% to Nigerians and Nigerian entrepreneurs. So what it means, arguably, is that Nigerian government will have like 5%. The structure, and do we really need in Nigeria Air, bearing in mind that AMCON also, there's ARIC Air now, I think, an Aero under the control of AMCON, because AMCON wants to recover its debt. So speak to me about this.
Well, I mean, I think depending on who you ask, they'll tell you, oh, national carrier is something we should have. I think the world has moved on beyond national carriers. Some countries are coming out and say, we want to have a national carrier. But when you look at those countries, they're not in the same league as Nigeria. Some African countries have actually come out because they haven't got the same wherewithal in terms of entrepreneurs in the country setting up airlines. You can take Uganda, you can take Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire. But when it comes to Nigeria, we actually have very, very well-organized private sector, and they have taken on the challenge. They've gotten some good funding in recent times, that we even have a situation where a couple of domestic airlines are actually acquiring brand new aircraft. If you already have that going for you, what I would expect at this point is for the government to create that enabling environment to allow for the viability of the domestic carriers that are already empowered. If you can ensure that domestic airlines can have access to cheap funds like their counterparts in Europe. I mean, British Airways does not buy an aircraft brand new, 100% cash. They sell the routes they're going to use to operate the aircraft on for the viability of the, of the business, to show the manufacturers, and the manufacturers will now get them funding through the Exim banks. That is how it is done. But in Nigeria, because of our, to a large extent, our records abroad, we have a situation where a lot of manufacturers are a bit reluctant to give us that access. But it is changing, which is why you have the likes of Air Peace acquiring brand new airplanes, Overland Airways, Ibom Air. These are domestic carriers, and they're well structured. They've been in the market for quite some time, and they're doing well enough to be able to move to that next level of being able to acquire brand new aircraft assets.
Oh, but with this structure that the federal government said, at least through Hadi Sirika,
yes,
do you think it's purely now government? Because government says it will own 5%. So invariably 95% is to others apart from the government.
Well, I mean, you can argue that government owns 5%, but the structure of that ownership is not transparent enough for us to understand, to know what it is. The 46 or odd percent that's going to be given to the private entrepreneurs, under what sort of structure is it going to be given? And who are the individuals that will be allowed access or, to be able to invest? You see, there's so much shrouded in secrecy at this point that we really cannot tell. Whatever the minister said is what we know. We do not know beyond what has been said. But if we want to take what he has said and review vis-a-vis the realities in the market, if you're going to start a national carrier and you're going to be leasing aircraft to be operated by another person on your behalf, then you're no more than a broker. Because what you're doing is the same problem we've had with private airlines doing wet leases. All the monies that you'll be spending to access those airplanes, to bring them to the Nigerian market, the employment that would have been generated, all those things would have been lost.
Okay. Though the minister says 70,000 jobs will be created, but we'll continue the conversation on a later day. Thank you very much, Captain Iyayi.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much
for coming. Thank you.
Yep.
I appreciate you. I've been speaking with Captain Rowland Iyayi, former Managing Director at the Nigerian Airspace Management Agency, NAMA, a former technical advisor to the Minister of Aviation, and the MD of Brass Aviation. That's the much we can take on today's edition of the program. Thank you all for joining us. Let's continue the conversation on all our social media platforms. I am Nancy Naji. Be the best you can be, be the change that you want to see by now.